My wife disappeared after a girls' trip. Years later, she returned with a baby. So I shut down her life. My name is James, I'm 34, and my story is about betrayal, a betrayal so deep that it shattered the foundation of everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the woman I vowed to spend my life with. You hear people say things like, "I never saw it coming," and honestly, that's exactly how it was for me. My wife, Sophie, 32, and I were together for 4 solid years, married for all of them. I thought we had a good thing going. We had plans, our whole life mapped out. For the most part, I genuinely believed we were on the same page. We both wanted kids, or at least I thought we both did. Right after we got married, we started talking about it seriously. Sophie would go on and on about how she wanted 2, maybe 3 kids. She had names picked out, plans for how we'd decorate the nursery, even which schools they'd attend. She'd sit online for hours, looking at baby clothes and gadgets, and we'd laugh, planning our dream life. It was our thing, something that kept us close. Everything felt perfect, and we were ready to start that next chapter. But life had other plans. After a few months of trying to conceive with no success, we decided to see a doctor. Long story short, the news wasn't what I expected or wanted to hear. It was me. My count was too low, and the chances of us having kids naturally were slim to none. Hearing that was like a punch to the gut. I felt useless, broken. Everything we dreamed of felt like it had slipped through my fingers. The news hit me so hard I spiraled into a dark place. Therapy helped me get through the worst of it. But in those early days, I was a mess. Sophie was supportive, at least at first. She reassured me that it didn't matter, that she'd be happy with just the 2 of us. But even in those moments, something about the way she said it felt off. It was like a switch had flipped. One minute she was obsessed with starting a family, and the next, she was brushing it off like it was nothing. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself she was just being strong for me. But as the months went by, I started to notice little things. She stopped mentioning kids entirely. She changed the subject if I brought up adoption or surrogacy. It was like she'd completely checked out of the idea of building a family. And then came the comments. Small digs at first. "Maybe you should get in shape," she'd say. Or, "You could be more productive around the house." I put on a few pounds, sure, but her words cut deeper than they should have. It felt like she was blaming me not just for our situation, but for everything. When I confronted her about the sudden change in her attitude, she'd brush me off, calling me overly sensitive or imagining things. But I wasn't imagining it. I could feel the distance growing between us. The woman who used to dream with me about the future was gone. In her place was someone cold and detached, someone who seemed to be biding her time. Fast forward a couple of years, and we were just existing. We lived together, but we were like strangers sharing a space. I tried to bring up other options for having kids, but Sophie would shut it down every time. "I'm happy as long as we're together," she'd say. But I didn't believe her. Then one day, out of the blue, she told me she wanted to go on a girls' trip. This wasn't unusual. Sophie had gone on trips with her friends before, and I'd always supported her. We lived in Brighton, and she'd mentioned wanting to visit America for a while. So, I didn't think twice about it. I even helped her pack, made sure she had everything she needed, and dropped her off at the airport. The last thing she said to me before she left was, "Thank you for being so supportive." At the time, it felt odd, like she was saying goodbye, not see you soon. But I brushed it off. That night, I stayed up so I could call her once her flight landed. Her flight was supposed to take 9 hours, so I kept myself busy, watching TV and checking the clock. When I saw her flight had landed, I gave her a call. It rang and rang. No answer. I figured she was tired or had gone straight to her hotel. But by morning, I still hadn't heard from her. I tried calling again, then texting. Still nothing. Panic set in. I called her sister. No, she hadn't heard from Sophie. Then I reached out to her friends, the ones she was supposedly on the trip with. That's when the bottom fell out of my world. They weren't on the trip with her. In fact, they were 2 blocks away, having coffee. Sophie hadn't gone anywhere with anyone. She was just gone. Sitting there with the phone in my hand, I felt like my stomach had dropped through the floor. Everything started clicking: the coldness, the avoidance, the thank you for being supportive. She'd planned this. She'd lied to me, packed her bags, and disappeared. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of mistake. Maybe she missed a connecting flight, or there was an emergency. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at my phone, waiting for a text, a call, anything. Nothing came. The next morning, her side of the bed was empty, and the reality hit me like a freight train. Sophie wasn't coming back. The excuses didn't hold up anymore. It was clear Sophie had planned this and wanted out of our marriage. For the first few days after she disappeared, I was in total denial. I kept calling her phone, hoping to hear her voice, praying for some kind of explanation. I left message after message, not even sure what to say most of the time, but desperate for anything that might get through to her. All I got in return was silence, nothing but an empty void that somehow made it all feel even worse. It was like being abandoned without so much as a reason, left to piece everything together on my own. The woman I had loved and shared my life with suddenly felt like a stranger. At first, Sophie's family was as blindsided as I was. Her mother, Eleanor, had no idea about her plans. She hadn't heard from Sophie either. In the weeks that followed, I ended up going over to her mom's house more times than I could count. Eleanor seemed to feel sorry for me. She'd let me crash on her couch on nights when I couldn't bring myself to go home to an empty house. Sometimes she'd cook for me, and we'd sit at the kitchen table, going over the small, puzzling details of Sophie's sudden departure, trying to make sense of it all. There were times when I'd talk for hours, pouring out my confusion and heartbreak, and other times when I'd just sit there in silence, too numb to speak. The emotional roller coaster was unbearable. Anger, sadness, guilt, they all hit me in waves. I couldn't stop asking myself what I'd done wrong. Had I missed some critical sign? Had I failed her in some way? I became obsessed with finding answers. I'd replay every conversation we'd ever had, every argument, every moment that seemed off, looking for the turning point where everything fell apart. I barely ate, barely slept. My work suffered, and my co-workers started noticing. When they asked if I was okay, I just shrug it off and mumble something about dealing with personal issues. I was too embarrassed to admit what had happened. Eventually, I confided in a few close friends. They did their best to distract me, dragging me out of the house to grab drinks or watch a game. But even when I was with them, my mind stayed stuck on Sophie. I kept wondering where she was and why I hadn't been enough to make her stay. One of the hardest parts was the constant questions from people who didn't know. Neighbors, extended family, old friends. Everyone who knew I was married would ask, "How's Sophie? How's married life treating you?" Each time, it felt like someone was tearing open a fresh wound. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, so I'd plaster on a fake smile and say, "Everything's fine." But every lie weighed me down more and more. After months of barely functioning, I knew I couldn't handle it alone anymore. That's when I turned to therapy. I'd never considered it before, but I didn't see another way out. Once a week, I'd sit with my therapist and vent about everything: the betrayal, the sleepless nights, the emptiness she'd left behind. Over time, therapy helped me realize something important. There wasn't a single moment or mistake that drove her away. She made the choice to leave, and that was on her, not me. Accepting that truth was one of the hardest things I've ever done. For the longest time, I felt like I was fundamentally broken, like there was something wrong with me that made her leave. But slowly, I started to see the cracks in our relationship for what they were. Sophie had been pulling away for a long time, and I had been blind to it, convincing myself that my love and effort would be enough to hold us together. Bit by bit, I began to rebuild my life. I threw myself into work, and the focus paid off. Within a year, I earned a promotion that gave me a renewed sense of purpose. Outside of work, I picked up old hobbies I'd neglected, like cooking and reading. I even started going to the gym, not just to stay busy, but because it felt good to take care of myself again. Reconnecting with old friends also helped. We'd go hiking, play golf, or just hang out, things I hadn't done in years. Being around people who weren't tied to the pain of my marriage made it easier to move forward. Slowly, the memories of Sophie stopped haunting me. I could finally look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by her betrayal. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was proud of how far I'd come. I thought I'd put everything behind me. Sophie was no longer a constant shadow in my life. Then, one Saturday morning, there was a knock on my door. I opened it, and there Sophie was standing on my doorstep, holding a baby. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. She looked almost the same as I remembered, though a little more tired, a little more worn down. She gave me this hopeful smile, like she actually thought I'd be happy to see her. All those emotions I thought I'd buried came rushing back: anger, sadness, confusion. But I didn't let them show. I just stared at her, stunned. She broke the silence first. "James," she said softly, "I know this is a shock, but I wanted to explain everything." Explain. The nerve of her, showing up like this after all she'd done. She asked if she could come in, but I shook my head. "No," I said firmly. "You can explain right here." For the first time in years, I was in control of the conversation, and I wasn't about to let her take that away from me. She stood there, holding a baby in her arms, claiming that she'd lost the best thing that had ever happened to her. Words, not mine. She said that after spending years reflecting and now having this child, she finally understood what truly mattered. Apparently, what mattered most was showing up unannounced at my door after years of silence, as though it was her right to come back. She looked down at the baby and said, "This is our second chance." I was stunned. A second chance, as if this child was some kind of reset button that would instantly erase everything that had happened between us. She honestly believed we could just pick up right where we left off. Inside, I was furious, but I kept my face neutral. She went on to say that she wanted us to be a family again, that she'd made a huge mistake, and now we could start over, just the three of us. I couldn't hold back anymore. I needed to know. I asked, "Why did you leave?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but I was about to lose control. After years of wondering, I needed an answer from her. She hesitated, looking down at her feet, and then finally spoke. She said, in the most nonchalant tone, that she left because she wanted a child, and since I couldn't give her one, she found someone who could. She said it like it was no big deal, as if her abandonment didn't completely shatter my life, as if I should just accept it. She continued, explaining how the man she had left with hadn't stuck around, but by then, she had the baby and realized she wanted to come back. Just like that, simple as that. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She'd walked away, built a life with someone else, had his child, and now expected me to welcome her back as though nothing had happened. I paused for a moment, trying to process everything she was saying. I looked at her, unable to hide the disbelief on my face. I told her, "So you left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can come back like nothing happened?" She began to cry, apologizing, saying she'd made a huge mistake, but it did nothing for me. Her tears didn't move me, not after everything she'd done. She went on, repeating how she realized I was the one she truly loved and that we were meant to be together. The words sounded so rehearsed, so desperate. I could see right through her. This wasn't love, it was desperation, and I could see the reality of it in her face. Then, as if trying to guilt-trip me, she talked about how hard it had been for her as a single mom, how difficult her life had been. She painted herself as the victim in all this, as if the choices she'd made weren't the very thing that led her to where she was now. She said she needed my support, that she was ready to make things work this time. And that's when it hit me. Who did she think I was? I stood there, listening, but at that point, I was done. I told her flatly, "You made your choice a long time ago, and now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here." She was shocked, like she never imagined I'd say no. I could see the disbelief in her eyes, but I wasn't backing down. I thought that would be the end of it, But then her anger flared up, her tone shifted, and she started yelling at me, calling me selfish, telling me I owed her a chance to make things right. She even had the nerve to say that if she'd wanted to, she could have divorced me and taken half of everything. She mentioned the house, too, saying it should still be hers. The audacity was staggering. In that moment, I felt this immense relief. It was like the mask had fallen, and I was finally seeing her for who she really was. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, "We're done. You wanted a different life, and now you have it. This isn't my responsibility anymore." And with that, I shut the door in her face, cutting off whatever final words she had left. Standing there, listening to her muffled shouts on the other side of the door, a strange calm washed over me. I knew I'd never let her back in. The woman I had loved, the woman I had married, was gone, replaced by a stranger who thought she could waltz back into my life when it suited her. I walked away from the door and sat down, feeling lighter than I had in years. For a moment, I thought that was it, that she would get the message and leave. But no, she started banging on the door, yelling all kinds of things. It was unreal. There I was, in the one place I had finally made my own, rebuilt from the mess she had left me in. And she had the audacity to demand I listen to her. I almost ignored it, just letting her scream herself out. But then curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what kind of excuses she would come up with. So, I opened the door just a crack, enough to show her I was listening, but not letting her in. Her face showed disbelief, like she was shocked I hadn't given her the reaction she wanted. She launched into this long monologue about how she was willing to forgive me for slamming the door, how we could start fresh. It was as though she thought we were just having a petty argument, not dealing with the fact that she had abandoned me without a word. At that point, I couldn't hold back. I actually laughed, because the sheer nerve of this woman was beyond anything I had ever experienced. She was furious, but I couldn't stop myself. I told her, "You left. You had your chance, and you threw it all away. I'm not going to pretend none of that happened just because you feel like it now." Her face turned red, and she started talking about how I didn't understand how hard it had been for her, how lost she had felt after leaving. But I wasn't buying it. I told her, "Leaving was your choice. You planned it, lied about it, and went through with it. Your regret doesn't mean anything now." That's when everything changed. Her tone dropped the remorseful act. She snapped, saying I was being unfair, that I didn't have the decency to give her another chance. Then, incredibly, she said, "If I'd wanted to, I could have taken everything from you back then. I could have taken half of everything you own." I couldn't believe my ears. This woman, who had left me without a word, now thought she deserved credit for not financially ruining me. I stood there, astonished, and said, "So what am I supposed to be grateful for?" "Grateful that you ditched me, but didn't take my stuff with you." She stared at me, her face a mix of anger and something else, desperation, guilt. I don't know, but honestly, I didn't care anymore. All those years of guilt, all those months of questioning myself, wondering if I was somehow to blame, they all melted away right there. I was done. I finally saw her for who she truly was, and in that moment, it felt like the weight I'd been carrying was lifted. She wasn't finished, though. She started pacing on my porch, ranting about how I'd never find anyone like her, and how I'd regret not giving her another chance. It was insane. She, the one who had wrecked everything we had, was now trying to convince me I should beg her to stay. When she realized I wasn't budging, she turned up the volume, claiming I had forced her to leave in the first place. She said that if I'd been more understanding about having kids, none of this would have happened. According to her logic, my inability to give her a child meant I failed as a husband, which somehow justified her running off to have one with someone else. The mental gymnastics were impressive, honestly. I couldn't believe she was trying to blame me for her own choices. I told her flat out, "If you wanted a child that badly, you could have told me the truth. You didn't have to lie to my face and pretend everything was fine while planning your exit." She stood there, staring at me like I'd slapped her, but I didn't let her speak. I told her, "You made that choice, and now you've got to live with it. That's not my problem." She tried one last angle, shifting back to her sad, pleading face, asking me to think about the child, and how I was being unfair by turning my back on him. She had the baby in her arms, and was using him to guilt-trip me. But I wasn't falling for it. I said, I don't know that child. I have nothing to do with him, and neither do I have anything to do with you. That was it. The realization started to sink in for her. She knew I wasn't going to change my mind, that there was no way I'd let her back into my life. I saw the anger fading from her face, replaced by something else, maybe actual regret, maybe frustration, but I didn't care. She was just a stranger to me now, a stranger who thought she could walk all over me, and that I'd thank her for it. She stood there for a few more seconds, waiting for me to call her back, but I didn't say a word. I just watched her face as it dawned on her that I meant every word. Then, without a second glance, I shut the door. This time, I didn't wait for her to bang on it again. I knew deep down that I'd made my decision, and there was no going back. I walked away from the door feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I had spent so much time wondering if I could ever move on from her, but now it was over. No second chances, not for her, not for us. She was just a memory now, and I was finally free. A few days later, I got a text from her mom. She apologized, saying she was ashamed of how her daughter had handled everything, and that she'd tried to talk some sense into her. Her mom was a good person, and had helped me out after her daughter left, so I could tell she was genuinely upset. I didn't hold anything against her, but I wasn't about to get roped back into the mess. I replied politely, thanked her for checking in, and left it at that. I wasn't going to explain my decision further. She understood it was over. Over the next few weeks, I heard bits and pieces through mutual friends and social media. Apparently, she had gone back to living with her parents, but things weren't going smoothly. The guy she left me for had bailed on her, and now she was stuck trying to figure it out on her own. She had burned all her bridges, and no one was willing to help. Her old friends, the ones who had stood by me when she first disappeared, had no sympathy for her. They had moved on and weren't interested in getting involved in her drama again. Her parents weren't thrilled either. They weren't in a position to offer much support. Not long after her mom texted me, I got a call from her dad. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the best of me. He was polite, but direct. He mentioned they were struggling financially and hinted that maybe I could help out. I listened, but when he started talking about how his daughter needed a little support to get back on her feet, I couldn't help but laugh, not out loud, but you get the point. I told him as kindly as I could that his daughter's choices were her own, and that I wasn't in any position to help. I think he got the message because he didn't press further. Next, her friends started reaching out. People I hadn't heard from in years tried the guilt angle, saying she was having a rough time and that maybe I could give her another chance. One friend even had the nerve to suggest that the kid needed a father figure and that I shouldn't let my bitterness get in the way of helping him. I stood my ground. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel bad for choosing myself after years of feeling like I wasn't enough. I'd given everything I had, and she threw it away. The least she could do was own her choices, instead of expecting me to bail her out. Over time, the calls and messages slowed down and eventually stopped. Everyone seemed to understand that I was serious. I had moved on. That's when the real peace set in. My life became quiet, normal in a way it hadn't been in years. I had my routines, my friends, and my work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had rebuilt it on my own terms. The funny thing was, I started finding happiness in the little things I hadn't noticed when I was married. I'd go for walks, cook my own meals, read books I had meant to get to for years. The freedom was refreshing, and I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to live the way I wanted. For once, I wasn't worried about someone else's approval or happiness. It was like I had gotten my life back piece by piece. Every now and then, I'd run into someone who knew both of us, and they'd ask, whatever happened with her? I'd give a brief, polite answer and change the subject. It wasn't that I was hiding anything. I just didn't want to revisit that chapter. She was part of my past, and I had learned to leave her there. As for her, The last I heard, things weren't going well. She was struggling to keep a job and bouncing between her parents' place and her friends' couches when she wore out her welcome. Some people who still had a connection with her reached out to me, saying she was asking for help from anyone who'd listen. A few even hinted that she hoped I'd change my mind and come back to help raise the kid. But that wasn't going to happen. I'd spent too much time rebuilding my life to even consider going down that road. I wasn't going to be her safety net. In the end, I got the closure I didn't know I needed. She made her choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences. Me, I finally felt free. Truly, genuinely free. In a way I hadn't felt since the day she left. I was done letting her shadow hang over me. I had moved on. That was enough.